Jessica Parker never thought she'd be the kind of person who ended up living in her car. She had followed all the rules. Worked hard. Paid her rent on time. Built a life that was supposed to be stable. But stability was an illusion, one that shattered the moment she found the eviction notice taped to her front door. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. The rent was increasing by 50% next month, a price hike she hadn't seen coming, one she couldn't possibly afford on her teacher's salary. Her mind raced. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe her landlord, Mr. Langley, had sent this to the wrong apartment. She rushed downstairs, the paper crumpled in her fist, her heart hammering as she knocked on his office door. Langley barely glanced up from his desk. "It's all there in the notice," he said flatly. "New rates start next month." Jessica clutched the paper tighter. I've lived here for 15 years. My rent has always been reasonable. I can't afford this. Can we negotiate?" Langley sighed, tapping his pen against the desk. "I get it, Ms. Parker. But I've got investors now. They want market rate pricing. Nothing personal, just business." "Nothing personal." She wanted to scream. 2 weeks, he added. "That's how long you have to figure something out." Jessica walked out of his office in a daze, the world around her tilting. She had 2 weeks to find a new place, but where? Everywhere in town was just as expensive, if not worse. Her teacher's salary stretched thin as it was. Moving required deposits, application fees, money she didn't have. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, bills spread out before her, doing the math over and over, hoping for a different answer. There wasn't one. 2 weeks later, Jessica stood on the sidewalk, staring at the place that had been her home for 15 years. A single suitcase sat beside her. Everything else, furniture, books, framed photos, had been sold, donated, or left behind. The apartment lights still glowed warmly from inside. Someone else would be moving in soon. Someone who could afford it. She swallowed the lump in her throat, shoved the suitcase into the trunk of her car, and slid into the driver's seat. The key turned in the ignition. The engine hummed. She had no destination. No plan. Just the sinking realization that for the first time in her life, she was homeless. Jessica sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The hum of the engine was steady, reliable, unlike everything else in her life. She was parked 2 blocks away from her old apartment, where the windows still glowed with the life she had lost. A new tenant had probably already signed the lease. Maybe someone younger, someone with a tech job that paid twice what she made as a teacher. She should start driving. She knew that. But where? She had no backup plan. No relatives nearby. No savings cushion to soften the fall. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts. Who could she call? Her best friend, Naomi? No, Naomi had a newborn and barely enough space in her tiny 1-bedroom apartment. Her colleague, Mrs. Evans? No, she'd offered once before to let Jessica crash on her couch during a bad breakup, but that was different. That wasn't this. Jessica's stomach twisted. The truth settled in. There was no one. A sharp knock on her window made her jump. A cop. Flashlight raised, tapping against the glass. Jessica rolled it down, forcing her voice steady. "Good evening, officer." "Ma'am, are you aware you're parked in a no overnight zone?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. What was she supposed to say? "I know, but I have nowhere else to go." The officer's expression softened as he took in her overstuffed car, the clothes piled in the back seat, the grocery bags stuffed with toiletries. A sigh. "Look, I'll let it slide tonight, but you can't sleep here. You'll need to move along." Jessica nodded quickly. "Of course. Thank you." As soon as he walked away, she threw the car into drive and pulled onto the road. She drove aimlessly, past streets she had walked every day for years, past the school where she had spent her career shaping young minds while her own life crumbled. Eventually, she found a quiet Walmart parking lot and pulled in. She adjusted the seat, curling onto her side as best she could. The car was cold. The backache started almost immediately. She shut her eyes, willing herself to sleep. But sleep didn't come. Instead, the weight of reality pressed down on her like a stone. How had it come to this? One rent hike. One bad month. That was all it took to push her from middle-class stability to nowhere. She thought of her students. Would they recognize her if they saw her like this? Would they understand how quickly life could turn? A tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it away. Tomorrow, she would figure something out. But tonight, in the silence of her car, she let herself grieve the life she had lost. Morning came too soon. Jessica's neck throbbed from the awkward angle she had slept in. The cheap sweater she had used as a blanket had done little against the early autumn chill. She sat up, stretching, her muscles aching from the stiffness of sleeping in a car. Around her, the Walmart parking lot was waking up, early morning shoppers loading groceries, employees in blue vests gathering carts. She needed to move. Her stomach growled, but food was a luxury she couldn't afford to waste money on yet. She had to think long-term. She pulled down the sun visor, catching a glimpse of herself in the tiny mirror. Her brown hair was tangled, the lines under her eyes deeper than usual. She looked like someone she didn't recognize. She rummaged through her purse, found an old hair tie, and pulled her hair into a loose bun. First step, find a place to clean up. She drove to the nearest 24-hour gym, one of the few places where no one would question her walking in with a bag and leaving freshly showered. Inside, she moved quickly, shampooing, scrubbing, trying not to think about the fact that this wasn't just an inconvenient morning routine. This was survival now. By the time she stepped back outside, the sun was higher, and the day was waiting for her. Second step, find work. Her teaching job had been steady, reliable, but it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Jessica pulled out her phone, scrolling through job listings. Most required degrees she already had. But degrees didn't matter when you had no address, no way to prove stability. She needed something immediate. Cash in hand. Waitressing? Retail? Temp work? She drove from business to business, filling out applications. A diner. A bookstore. A coffee shop. A department store. At the coffee shop, the manager, a woman in her late 20s with cropped blue hair and tired eyes, studied Jessica's application. "You were a teacher?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Jessica forced a smile. "Still am. Just looking for extra work." The manager nodded, scribbling something down. "We need help with the morning rush. Can you start tomorrow?" Relief flooded her. Absolutely. It wasn't much. Minimum wage, early hours. But it was something. And something was more than she had yesterday. As Jessica walked back to her car, she inhaled deeply, letting the cool air fill her lungs. Her life had shrunk down to the basics: shelter, food, survival. But she wasn't done fighting yet. She had lost her home. But she wouldn't lose herself. The first shift at the coffee shop was brutal. Jessica had spent years on her feet, pacing in front of whiteboards, leading classroom discussions, but nothing compared to the chaos of a morning rush. Steam hissed, espresso machines whined, customers barked orders, and Jessica, still learning the register, fumbled with buttons while the line grew longer. "Ma'am, I ordered an oat milk latte, not whatever this is," a woman snapped, pushing the cup back toward her. Jessica took it, forcing herself to smile. "I'll fix it right away." Her hands trembled as she remade the drink, trying to keep up with the blur of activity around her. By the time her break rolled around, she was exhausted, her shirt stained with coffee, her hair damp with sweat. She grabbed a bottle of water and collapsed onto a stool in the back. "Rough first day?" Jessica looked up. The blue-haired manager, Tessa, was leaning against a crate of supplies, watching her with a knowing smirk. Jessica let out a breathless laugh. You could say that. Tessa shrugged. You'll get the hang of it. Nobody walks in a pro. She studied Jessica for a moment, then asked, You said you were a teacher. Why this job? Jessica hesitated, fingers tightening around the water bottle. How much should she tell? If she admitted the truth, that she was homeless, living in her car, and barely holding herself together, would they fire her? Would they pity her? She swallowed. Just needed extra income. Tessa nodded, as if she saw through the lie but wasn't going to press. Well, if you need extra shifts, let me know. Jessica managed a small smile. Thanks. The words were simple, but they felt like a lifeline. For the next few weeks, Jessica settled into a new routine, a routine that looked nothing like her old life. Wake up before sunrise in a different parking lot each morning. Use the gym showers to stay clean. Work long shifts at the coffee shop. Spend evenings in the library, filling out job applications and charging her phone. Try to sleep, despite the fear that someone would knock on her car window again. It was exhausting, but it was survival. And then, one night, as she sat in the front seat of her car, sorting through crumpled dollar bills from her tips, she realized something. She was saving money. Not much. But enough. Enough to start wondering, how long would it take to get out of this? Enough to start dreaming again. Winter came fast. The first night the temperature dropped below freezing, Jessica realized just how dangerous this life could be. She had parked behind a 24-hour grocery store, curled in the back seat under a pile of thrifted blankets, but the cold cut through everything. Her fingers went numb. Her breath turned to mist. For the first time since losing her home, she was afraid she might not wake up. By morning, her body ached, her joints stiff as she forced herself upright. She needed a real plan, not just survival, but a way out. That afternoon, after her shift at the coffee shop, Jessica sat in the library with her laptop, staring at an empty Google search bar. She had applied to dozens of jobs, corporate positions, remote teaching gigs, anything that fit her resume. No one responded. The gap in her employment history swallowed her chances before she even got a foot in the door. Her stomach twisted. I can't keep waiting. She opened Nextdoor, the neighborhood networking app, and typed with trembling fingers. Former math teacher looking for tutoring work. Available afternoons and evenings. References available. She hovered over the post button. Would anyone even care? Would her former students recognize her name and wonder how far she had fallen? Her pride screamed at her to close the app. Instead, she hit post. Then she waited. The first message came in at 2:17 a.m. A single mom needed help for her 8th grader, who was failing algebra. The second message arrived before sunrise. A man wanted SAT prep for his high school senior. By noon, her inbox was full. Jessica pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. She wasn't invisible. People still needed what she had to offer. She had spent months feeling like she had nothing left, but now, for the first time in a long time, she had options. The tutoring job took off faster than she expected. At first, she met students in libraries and coffee shops, scribbling equations on napkins, pretending not to notice when baristas gave her tired glances for staying too long. Then a client offered to meet at the community center on Maple Street. Jessica hesitated. She had avoided places like that, places that screamed rock bottom. But she needed the money. So, the next evening, she walked through the center's front doors. The space buzzed with activity, women sorting through donated clothes, volunteers serving hot meals, a few people hunched over computers. A woman at the front desk glanced up, her face lighting up in recognition. First time here? She asked. Jessica nodded. The woman smiled, adjusting the lanyard around her neck. I'm Linda. Let me show you around. Something in her voice made Jessica pause. Not pity. Understanding. Linda led her past a row of classrooms, where kids worked with tutors, their laughter spilling into the halls. We offer free tutoring rooms, Linda explained. No charge. We're all about helping people get back on their feet. Jessica stared at her. Why do you do this? Linda's smile softened. I used to be homeless too. Jessica blinked. Linda continued, matter of fact. I was a nurse for 20 years. Got laid off during the pandemic. My savings ran out. Lost my place. I lived in my car for almost a year before I found this place. Jessica's throat tightened. She had never met someone who had been where she was. Linda patted her shoulder. I got back on my feet. You will too. Jessica swallowed hard. She wasn't alone. She started small, 1 student, then 2, then 5. Within a month, she was making more money tutoring than she was at the coffee shop. Within 2 months, she had enough to rent a small room in a shared apartment. The night she moved in, she sat on the thin mattress, her hand pressed against the cool wooden floor. It wasn't much. But it wasn't her car. For the first time in months, she let herself exhale. A week later, Jessica left the community center after a long day, her bag full of tutoring notes and lesson plans. As she walked past a real estate office, something caught her eye. A for sale sign in the window. She slowed, scanning the details. A small commercial building. Good location. Potential for development. Her stomach flipped. It was stupid to even consider it. She barely had enough saved for a better apartment. She was just now clawing her way back. But then her eyes landed on the name of the current owner. Langley Holdings. Her breath caught. That was the real estate firm that had bought her old apartment building. The same firm that had raised her rent. The same firm that had evicted her. She stared at the listing, her heart pounding. Was this a coincidence? Or was this a chance? That night, lying on her bed in her tiny room, she found herself doing the math. What if? What if she stopped thinking small? What if she didn't just rebuild her life, but built something bigger? Something that could never be taken from her again? Jessica couldn't shake the thought. The Langley-owned building wasn't just another real estate listing, it was a symbol. The same company that had torn her life apart was now trying to offload property after the market crash. It felt like fate. But fate didn't come with a down payment. She didn't have nearly enough money to buy a building. Still, the idea clung to her. That night, she sat on her bed, flipping through her notes, trying to focus on tomorrow's tutoring sessions. But all she could see was that for sale sign. What if I don't wait? She grabbed her laptop and started searching. How to buy commercial real estate with no money. Funding options for first-time buyers. Loans for small businesses. Most results were discouraging. Then she found something, a government grant for women-owned businesses. Her breath caught. The deadline was in 2 weeks. Her fingers flew over the keyboard. She had never written a business proposal before. But she had written hundreds of lesson plans, analyzed data, managed classrooms. She could learn. Over the next few days, she juggled tutoring, grant writing, and research. Her schedule was brutal: morning tutoring sessions, afternoons at the library, nights drafting and revising. Linda noticed the exhaustion creeping into Jessica's face. You look like you haven't slept in days, she said, sliding a cup of coffee across the table. Jessica barely looked up from her laptop. I'm fine. Linda frowned. What are you doing? Jessica hesitated. Would it sound crazy? She took a deep breath. I'm trying to buy a building. Linda blinked. Jessica exhaled. The tutoring's going well. I have savings. But I found this grant. If I can get it, I might actually have a shot. Linda's expression shifted. Not disbelief. Not pity. Respect. Then she grinned. You know, you remind me of myself. Jessica scoffed. What, sleep deprived? Linda laughed. Determined. She tapped a pen against the table. How about this? I help you with the financials, and you let me sit in on a tutoring session? Jessica raised an eyebrow. Why? Linda leaned back. I used to be a nurse. I'm thinking about getting certified as a medical instructor. I want to teach again. Jessica had never seen Linda hesitate. She was always so sure of herself. But now, for the first time, she looked uncertain. Jessica smirked. Deal. The next week was a blur of numbers, late nights, and caffeine. Linda helped her find the proposal. Jessica ran trial tutoring sessions at the community center, proving she could scale into a real business. When she finally submitted the grant application, she felt like she had poured every last drop of herself into it. Now, all she could do was wait. A month later, an email arrived. Jessica almost didn't open it. Her hand shook as she clicked. Congratulations! Your application for the Women's Business Grant has been approved for initial funding. She read it twice. 3 times. She had done it. She wasn't just getting back on her feet. She was about to own the building that once threw her out. Jessica stared at the email, heart pounding. The grant wasn't enough to buy the building outright, but it was a start. She had funding. She had a plan. Now, she needed the rest of the money. The next morning, she marched into Springfield Credit Union, dressed in the best blazer she owned, the same one she had worn to job interviews that never called back. But today, she wasn't here to beg for a job. She was here to buy a building. She sat across from the loan officer, a man in his 40s with tired eyes and a skeptical frown. You're requesting a commercial loan, he said, flipping through her paperwork. Jessica nodded. I have a government grant covering 30% of the purchase price. I've also built a tutoring business that's bringing in steady income. He tapped his pen against his desk. Your business is still new. You were unemployed before this? Jessica forced herself to hold his gaze. I was a teacher for 20 years. Then I was evicted when my rent tripled. I had to start over from nothing, and I did. She leaned forward. I don't just want this building. I know what to do with it. She laid out her plan. Not just a tutoring center. A community learning space. Rooms for adult education, career training, after-school programs. Affordable rent for small businesses. Springfield needs this, she said. And I need this. The loan officer sighed, rubbing his temple. Then he set down his pen. I'll be honest, he said. Most banks wouldn't take a chance on this. Jessica's stomach sank. But, he continued, his lips curling into a small smile, we're not most banks. Loan approved. Jessica choked back a laugh, pressing a hand to her mouth. She had done it. 1 week later, she sat in the real estate office, signing the final paperwork. The building was hers. It felt surreal, like she was living in someone else's life. A year ago, she was sleeping in her car, shivering through winter nights, hoping she'd make it to morning. Now, she held the keys to a place she had once been forced to leave. She walked through the front doors alone. The space was cold, empty, but full of possibility. She ran her fingers along the old walls, imagining what it could become. Then she reached the window and froze. A familiar figure stood on the sidewalk. Langley. The landlord who had kicked her out. The man who had looked her in the eye and told her, in the coldest voice, that it wasn't personal. Now, he stood there, staring at the under new ownership sign. His jaw clenched. Jessica smiled. Poetic justice. She pushed open the door, stepping outside. Langley turned, eyes narrowing. You bought it, he said. Jessica crossed her arms. I did. A muscle in his jaw twitched. You're renting out office space, right? She raised an eyebrow. Why? He exhaled, shoulders dropping. My firm is downsizing. We lost a lot in the market crash. I was looking for a new place. Jessica let the silence stretch. Then she smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. "Well," she said, tilting her head, "I'll need to check your references." Langley's face darkened. Jessica turned, stepping back into her building, the door clicking shut behind her. For the first time in a long time, she felt completely, undeniably in control. Jessica stood in the empty office, running her fingers along the cold, peeling walls. She had won. But winning wasn't enough. She didn't just want to own this building, she wanted to change what it stood for. No longer a place where people were thrown out. No longer a place where landlords like Langley dictated who belonged and who didn't. It would be a place of second chances. The next few months were a whirlwind. Jessica threw herself into renovations, turning rooms into classrooms, workspaces, and community hubs. She reached out to local businesses, nonprofits, and former teachers like herself, people who believed in helping others rise. Linda came on board as a program director, using her nursing background to help launch career retraining workshops for unemployed women. A local coffee shop leased space for a cafe on the first floor, giving jobs to single mothers and older workers who had been pushed out of the workforce. One by one, empty rooms filled with purpose. A year ago, Jessica had nowhere to go. Now, she had created a place people could turn to when the world pushed them aside. Opening day arrived on a crisp autumn morning. Jessica stood in front of the building, a new sign gleaming above the entrance. Reclaimed Hope Center. Not just a business. Not just real estate. A symbol of survival. A promise. A small crowd gathered, former students, families she had tutored, community members, even people who had once walked past her when she was living in her car. Linda squeezed her shoulder. "Ready?" Jessica took a deep breath, looking out at the people who had supported her, at the place she had built from the ground up. She smiled. She wasn't just ready. She was home. As she stepped forward to cut the ribbon, a voice called out from the crowd. "Jessica." She turned. Langley. The man who had once signed her eviction notice now stood among the guests, looking uncomfortable, out of place. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then, to Jessica's complete shock, he held out his hand. "I was wrong about you," he admitted. "I didn't think people could come back from that. I see now that I was wrong." Jessica glanced at his outstretched hand. She could have left him standing there. She could have walked away. Instead, she took a slow breath and met his gaze. "People don't come back from this alone," she said. "They come back when someone gives them a chance." She didn't shake his hand. But she didn't turn away, either. Langley nodded once, understanding. And then, for the first time, he was the one to walk away. Later that night, long after the guests had gone, Jessica stood on the rooftop of her building, looking down at the city that had once abandoned her. She had nothing once. Now, she had a business. A home. A purpose. She traced the cool metal of her keys in her hand, thinking about the night she had lost everything. Then she looked out at the lights flickering across the city and whispered to herself. "I didn't just survive. I reclaimed my life. And this time, no one could take it away from her." This story is more than just revenge, it's about resilience, about turning hardship into strength. Jessica's journey shows that life doesn't end when you lose everything. Sometimes, it's the beginning of something greater. She didn't just get back at Langley, she built a space where others like her could rebuild their lives, proving that success is the best revenge. Now, we want to hear from you. What would you have done in Jessica's place? Would you have let Langley rent from you, or would you have shut the door for good? Comment 2 if you loved her story and 7 if you think she should have done more. And if you enjoy powerful, real-life stories like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to True Tales. Natalie will be back with more incredible stories every day.